I've always had a pretty normal life, nothing too out of the ordinary. But this one situation with my HOA left me questioning everything. It started on a regular afternoon, something that could have happened to anyone. But trust me when I tell you it spiraled into something absolutely ridiculous. So, a little backstory to set the stage. I'm disabled. I've been using a wheelchair since I was in my teens after an accident that left me with limited feeling in my legs. I still do as much as I can on my own, but I need help with certain things like getting in and out of the pool, which brings us to the heart of this mess. My husband and I had been looking for a house for a while, and we finally found one that seemed perfect. It was a ranch-style house, no steps at the front, which was perfect for me. We were thrilled to move in, but the real selling point for me was the backyard. It had a pool, an in-ground pool with a fenced-in yard, giving me some privacy. I had dreamed about having a pool for years, and now it seemed like a reality. But, of course, things couldn't just be easy. As is typical when you buy into a neighborhood with an HOA, we soon got to know the board, particularly the president, Vanessa. She was this woman who had been part of the HOA for a while, and when she came over to welcome us, I couldn't help but notice the way she looked at me. It wasn't an overtly rude glance, but you could tell she was taken aback by the fact that I used a wheelchair. It was the kind of look you get when someone isn't sure how to react to seeing someone like me. I didn't think too much about it at the time, but looking back, I should have recognized that look for what it was: discomfort. Things started off fine enough, but over time, I noticed a pattern. Whenever there was an issue with the house or something related to the neighborhood, Vanessa would direct all her communication to my husband. Even though I was the one home most of the time, she'd always wait for him to be around before addressing us. At first, I brushed it off as just a weird coincidence, but after a while, it became clear that she was just more comfortable dealing with him. Then came the pool situation. I'll never forget it. As soon as we moved in, I started thinking about how I could use the pool more effectively. With my disability, getting in and out of a regular pool was a challenge. So, we submitted a request to the HOA for some modifications to the pool area. We wanted to install shallow steps with handles that would allow me to get in and out of the pool more easily. It seemed like a simple request, and we were even willing to cover the costs ourselves. I'll tell you, getting the HOA's approval was like pulling teeth. We submitted the request in the spring, thinking it would be an easy win. But as winter rolled around, we hadn't heard a word back. My husband and I emailed Vanessa and called her multiple times, and each time we got the same response. Either no response at all or an excuse that she was too busy with other matters. It wasn't until we started pushing harder that she finally acknowledged the request, but only to say it was a cosmetic change that didn't require urgent attention. The frustrating part was that we weren't asking for major renovations. It was a simple set of steps and a ramp that could be installed temporarily without modifying the pool itself. But to Vanessa, it seemed like an unnecessary inconvenience. When I would try to explain that this was a matter of accessibility for me, she would dismiss it with, "That's not really something the HOA needs to focus on" attitude. So, after months of waiting, we decided to take matters into our own hands. My husband did some research and found a set of pool steps that didn't require any permanent changes to the pool. They were just a set of stairs that could be placed at the edge of the pool, allowing me to sit on them and gradually get into the water. It was a good solution, but when we started installing them, Vanessa showed up at our door. She was furious. "You can't just install things without approval," she practically yelled, standing there with her arms crossed. My husband tried to explain that there was no permanent alteration to the pool, and the steps could be removed at any time. But Vanessa wasn't hearing it. "This is a violation of HOA guidelines," she insisted, despite the fact that nothing had been drilled into the concrete. We tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't budge. I'm not one to back down easily, especially when it comes to my rights, but it felt like no matter what we said, she was determined to make this a bigger issue than it needed to be. Eventually, she left, promising to talk to the HOA board, but we never heard anything back. The whole situation left me feeling frustrated and helpless. It wasn't like I was asking for the moon, just a way to enjoy my own backyard and pool more easily. But Vanessa's attitude made it feel like I was some kind of burden. Weeks went by and I finally got a chance to use the pool. After a long day of work, my husband and I went out to the backyard, and I decided to sit by the pool to catch some sun. My husband jumped in to swim, and I just settled into my chair, feeling the warmth on my skin. I had always loved the water, but getting in was such a struggle. The steps we had installed weren't the perfect solution, but they worked. I was wearing a bikini because, frankly, it was hot, and I wanted to feel comfortable. The whole point of having a pool was to enjoy the freedom it gave me, to not worry about what others might think or say. I was in my own backyard, and I deserved to relax. My husband and I were talking, enjoying the afternoon, when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A scream. It wasn't a normal scream either. It was shrill, almost like something you'd hear in a horror movie. I turned to see Vanessa standing at the fence, looking completely enraged. Without even a moment's hesitation, she stormed into our yard, heading straight toward me. Her face was red, and she was sputtering, her words barely making sense. "You're inappropriate. This is indecent," she yelled, pointing at me, shaking with anger. I was shocked. My husband quickly got out of the pool, standing between Vanessa and me. "What's going on?" he asked calmly. He didn't raise his voice, but I could tell he was confused and concerned. She kept yelling at me, saying I shouldn't be wearing a bikini in front of others, even though our yard was fenced in and completely private. "People might be able to see you," she shouted. "It's wrong to flaunt your body like that." I couldn't even process what was happening. I asked her what was wrong with my choice of clothing. It was my yard, and I had the right to wear whatever I felt comfortable in. But she wasn't listening to reason. She looked past me and at my husband, accusing him of letting me act inappropriately. And the worst part? She didn't even look me in the eye. She didn't even treat me like a person, just a problem to be solved. At that point, I felt like enough was enough. I had my phone in my hand, and I started recording. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. As she kept shouting, my husband calmly asked her to leave our property, but she refused. Instead, she did something that floored me. She called the police. I could hardly believe what was happening. My heart was racing as I watched Vanessa dial the police. It was as if she was trying to escalate the situation, making it far worse than it needed to be. I had never felt so humiliated in my life, and the fact that she was willing to go that far over something so trivial made me feel like I was in the wrong somehow, even though I knew I wasn't. My husband, seeing how upset I was, took control of the situation. He spoke to Vanessa calmly, asking her to leave the yard so that we could deal with this like adults. But she refused, standing there with a smug expression on her face as she spoke into her phone. I could hear the operator on the other end, and Vanessa's voice was filled with a kind of certainty, as if she was convinced the police would be on her side. I was shaking at this point, feeling both angry and helpless. I didn't know what to expect, but within minutes, a police car pulled up in front of our house. I could feel the tension in the air as I watched the officer get out of the car, a tall, imposing figure who walked toward us with an air of authority. I could hear the siren in the distance fading away as I held my breath. The officer looked at Vanessa first, who pointed toward me with an accusing finger. "This woman is being inappropriate, officer," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's flaunting herself in front of the neighborhood, and I don't think that's acceptable." I wanted to speak up, to tell the officer how absurd this whole thing was, but my husband stepped in before I could say anything. "We're in our own backyard, and my wife is wearing a swimsuit. She's not bothering anyone." The officer looked from my husband to Vanessa, his face unreadable. He asked to see our IDs, and we handed them over without protest. I could feel my anxiety rising, and I was sure that Vanessa was hoping the officer would side with her. But what happened next took me by surprise. The officer nodded as he looked at both of us, then turned to Vanessa. "Ma'am, there's no crime here. If this is your personal opinion about what's appropriate or not, I suggest you keep it to yourself." His voice was firm but not unkind. "This is a private property matter, and there's no legal issue with what's going on here." Vanessa's face flushed a deep red, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth, clearly about to argue, but the officer cut her off. "If you have an issue with what's happening here, I suggest you take it up with the HOA, Not the police. He then turned to my husband and me and gave us a nod of approval. Carry on, folks. Enjoy your day. Couldn't believe it. After everything Vanessa had done, after all the stress and humiliation, the officer wasn't on her side. She stood there, utterly defeated, her face a picture of frustration. But before she turned to leave, she shot me one last look. It wasn't a look of anger. It was more like a warning. You haven't heard the last of this, she said. And without another word, she turned and walked away. The moment the officer left, I finally felt like I could breathe again. But that relief didn't last long. As much as I wanted to just forget the whole ordeal, I couldn't help but feel this weight on my shoulders. I was now certain that Vanessa wasn't going to let this go. It wasn't about me. It was about her power over the neighborhood. She was the HOA president, and she wasn't about to let someone like me, someone who didn't fit into her narrow vision of what was acceptable, get away with it. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. I knew Vanessa wasn't going to just forget about the incident. I didn't know what she'd do next, but I was starting to prepare for the worst. The HOA had already been difficult to deal with, but now, it felt like things were about to get much, much worse. Over the next few days, I kept a low profile. I didn't want to make any more waves than necessary, but I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had settled over me. Vanessa's words echoed in my mind. You haven't heard the last of this. And sure enough, a few days later, we received a letter from the HOA. The letter was brief but to the point. It was a formal notice of violation for unsanctioned pool modifications. Apparently, Vanessa had convinced the HOA board that the pool steps we'd installed violated some obscure rule about alterations to the pool area. There was no mention of the fact that the steps were removable and caused no permanent damage. Instead, the letter focused solely on the supposed violation and threatened us with fines if we didn't remove the steps immediately. I was furious. I couldn't believe that after everything we'd been through, the HOA was now trying to punish us for something so minor. But the more I read the letter, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the pool. This was Vanessa's way of getting back at me for standing up to her. She wasn't going to let me get away with this, no matter how trivial it seemed. We decided to take action. My husband and I consulted with a lawyer, and it didn't take long for us to understand that the HOA had no real grounds to enforce their demands. There was nothing in the HOA rules about removable pool steps, and nothing in the guidelines that said we couldn't make minor modifications to improve accessibility. Our lawyer wrote a letter to the HOA, stating that we would not be complying with their demands and that they should expect to be taken to court if they continued to harass us. We also made sure to include a copy of the police report from the incident with Vanessa, just to further illustrate the point that we weren't backing down. The next few weeks were tense, to say the least. Vanessa tried to rally the HOA board against us, but without legal grounds, they didn't have much of a case. The more she pushed, the more it became clear that her personal vendetta was just that, personal. She wasn't trying to protect the neighborhood or enforce any kind of legitimate rules. She was just trying to control people, especially people like me. In the end, the HOA dropped the case. They had no choice. My husband and I were willing to fight them if necessary, and that was something they weren't prepared to deal with. While the legal battle was over, the emotional toll it took on me was far from finished. I felt like I'd been constantly fighting for my right to exist comfortably in my own home, and that left me exhausted. But the relief from the HOA's withdrawal of the case didn't last as long as I had hoped. Even though they dropped the legal threats, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People who I'd once waved to while walking outside now avoided eye contact. It felt like everyone was whispering about me behind my back, especially after the news segment aired. I never realized how much influence an HOA president like Vanessa could wield, not just in the boardroom but in the everyday lives of the residents. It wasn't long before we received another notice. This one wasn't from the HOA, but from our local city council. Apparently, Vanessa had sent a complaint about the pool steps, claiming that our modifications violated city zoning laws. I was stunned. The complaint wasn't even about the pool itself but about the aesthetic of it and how it supposedly ruined the overall look of the neighborhood. Vanessa had taken her vendetta against us to a whole new level. By now, I had grown accustomed to the idea that people like Vanessa would stop at nothing to tear you down, and I was ready to fight back again. My husband was adamant that we weren't going to back down from this. The whole point of our pool was for me to regain some independence, to be able to enjoy the outdoors like everyone else. There was no way we were going to let her take that away from me. We hired another lawyer. This one was a local expert in property and zoning laws, and explained the situation. After reviewing the case, she reassured us that there was no legal precedent for what Vanessa was trying to do. It seemed like Vanessa was grasping at straws, trying to create problems that simply didn't exist. "Let's play this by the book," our lawyer told us. "You've done nothing wrong. And as for the neighbors, they're just intimidated by her. Don't let that pressure you." That advice gave me some peace of mind. We spent the next few weeks gathering documents, including the police report from the previous incident, the letters from the HOA, and even a detailed description of how the pool steps worked. It was clear that we had the law on our side, and I was determined to make sure Vanessa knew that she couldn't bully us out of our own home. Then the city council hearing date arrived. Felt like a strange mix of nerves and excitement. We were ready, but we also knew that this was going to be a battle. My husband and I dressed in business casual clothes, making sure we looked professional, even though we were dealing with something so personal. When we walked into the council chambers, we could feel the eyes on us. Vanessa was already sitting at a table, talking animatedly to a few of the council members. She looked confident, maybe even smug, as if she knew the outcome was going to go in her favor. I couldn't let that intimidate me. I was tired of being the passive one in these situations, and this was my chance to stand up for myself once and for all. The hearing started with the council members introducing themselves and explaining the process. We were asked to present our case first. My husband and I took turns speaking. I explained how the pool steps had been installed for my accessibility and how they could easily be removed if necessary. I shared how much the ability to enjoy the pool meant to me, not just as a luxury, but as part of my therapy and personal recovery. As we spoke, I noticed Vanessa shifting uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear she didn't expect us to be so well prepared. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and presented her case with the same accusations she'd made before. That the steps were a violation of neighborhood aesthetics, that they didn't align with HOA guidelines, and that they had caused a disruption in the neighborhood's harmony. But as she spoke, her tone became less about facts and more about personal opinions. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't about the pool anymore. This was personal. The council listened patiently, asking a few follow-up questions, and then it was time for deliberation. I was a bundle of nerves as I waited for their decision. After what felt like an eternity, they returned. One by one, the council members spoke up. After reviewing the details, including the HOA's actions and the city's zoning laws, "We've concluded that the steps do not violate any codes or rules," one of the council members said. "We understand that there's a personal disagreement at play here, but that does not give anyone the right to impose their own preferences on someone else's property." Another council member added, "The city is in support of people making modifications that improve their quality of life, especially when it comes to accessibility. We can't side with someone who's just unhappy with how someone else is using their own space." The vote was unanimous in our favor. My heart soared as I realized that this battle was finally over. Vanessa sat there, visibly stunned, as the council adjourned the hearing. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I had won, and not only that, but I had done it with integrity, standing up for myself in a way that I'd never done before. In the following weeks, the news spread through the neighborhood that Vanessa had lost her fight against us. People who had been avoiding us suddenly started to approach us again, and many even apologized for not standing up to Vanessa earlier. Some residents shared stories of how Vanessa had been a bully to them as well, using her position to control and intimidate others. It was a strange feeling, knowing that I wasn't the only one she'd tormented. But the best part of it all was the sense of peace that finally settled over our home. The pool steps stayed, and I was able to enjoy the pool again without fear of someone trying to take it away from me. My confidence grew, and so did my sense of freedom. I knew that I would never let anyone dictate what I could and couldn't do in my own space again. As for Vanessa, she was forced to step down from her position as HOA president shortly after her defeat. Word of her behavior had spread, and the board members couldn't ignore the pressure from the other residents. She moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, and with her departure, the HOA became a much more manageable organization. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe easy again. This experience had taught me so much, not just about standing up for myself, but about the power of community. It reminded me that no matter how big or small, every voice counts. And sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. It wasn't just about the pool steps. It was about reclaiming my life and showing that no one should be made to feel lesser because of a disability or because they didn't fit into someone else's narrow view of the world.